It began like most foolish adventures, with a dare. The sun was dipping low behind the twisted oak trees of Willowbrook, casting long, creeping shadows over the abandoned cemetery. A place that had long fallen out of memory for most, except for the whispers that passed between restless teens seeking thrills. The Cemetery of the Damned, they called it. A graveyard where the bodies of executed criminals were buried in shallow, unmarked graves, forgotten by their families, unburdened by the rites of peace. For years, the cemetery lay hidden, overtaken by the undergrowth, its iron gates rusted shut. But that only fueled the rumors, stories of how those who trespassed there heard the cries of the condemned, felt the icy grip of hands long dead. Stories meant to scare, meant to keep people away. But nothing could keep Jake, Ethan, Lauren, and Chloe from seeking a thrill. The four friends had been inseparable since middle school, the kind who thrived on dares and always tried to outdo one another. And tonight, it was Jake who made the dare. "Come on, you're not seriously afraid, are you?" Jake sneered, his cocky grin framed by the dim light of their phone flashlights. Ethan shifted nervously, glancing at the shadowy gates. "I'm not scared, it's just what? A bunch of old bones? Give me a break." Lauren rolled her eyes, but stayed close to Chloe, who remained uncharacteristically quiet. Chloe had been against the idea from the start, but she was outvoted. They had made the walk through the woods in the twilight, their laughter masking the creeping fear that none of them wanted to admit. As they reached the gates, Lauren gave a push, and with a creak that seemed too loud for the silence around them, the gate gave way. "See?" Jake smirked. "Piece of cake." They walked through the cemetery, their phones casting jittery beams of light across the overgrown path. The gravestones, where there were any, were so old that the names had faded, replaced with cracks and moss. But the feeling of the place was undeniable. It was heavy, oppressive, as if the earth itself resented being disturbed. Chloe stopped suddenly. "Maybe we shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice low, almost a plea. Jake turned, annoyed. "Oh, come on, we've barely even started. Don't go all ghost story on me now." But Chloe wasn't looking at Jake. Her eyes were fixed on something in the distance. "Look." They turned their lights towards where she pointed, and there, under a crumbling stone angel, was a grave unlike the others. The earth seemed disturbed, as if something had been dug up recently, or worse, as if something had clawed its way out. A nervous laugh escaped Lauren. Must have been some animal. But Jake, always one to take things further, stepped towards the grave, his grin widening. "I bet it's nothing. Just a bunch of dirt. But if you're all too scared to find out." "Jake, don't," Ethan warned, his voice strained. Ignoring him, Jake crouched, brushing the loose dirt with his hand, revealing something solid underneath. A coffin, or what was left of it. The wood splintered, the metal tarnished. But something else was wrong. As Jake brushed away more dirt, a smell hit them. A sour, rotting stench. Suddenly, the ground shifted. The dirt beneath Jake's feet seemed to sink, and with a sharp crack, the coffin lid collapsed inward. Jake jumped back, startled, but before he could say anything, the air around them grew cold. A bitter, unnatural cold that didn't belong to the warm autumn night. Chloe screamed as a wind howled through the cemetery, whipping through the trees, and for the briefest moment, they all heard it, a voice. Low, rasping, filled with hatred. "You will pay." Jake stumbled backward, his bravado gone. What the hell was that? But no one answered. They were all too focused on the shapes that seemed to move in the shadows, on the cold that seeped into their bones, and on the creeping realization that they had disturbed something far worse than just an old grave. The cold intensified, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. The night was silent, too silent, as if even the insects and birds had fled in fear. Chloe's scream echoed in their ears, and for a moment, none of them could move. The voice, that guttural, vengeful whisper, lingered in the air, and it was enough to freeze them where they stood. Jake was the first to react, trying to shake off the unease. Come on, it's probably just the wind or something. But his voice lacked its usual confidence. His eyes darted nervously around the cemetery, as if expecting something to leap out from the shadows. Ethan stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Jake, we need to leave. Now." But before anyone could move, the ground beneath their feet shifted again. This time it wasn't just the dirt. The very earth seemed to pulse, as if something deep below was stirring, awakening. The wind picked up, not the gentle breeze of a crisp autumn night, but a wild, howling force that tore through the trees, sending branches whipping through the air. Lauren let out a yelp as a branch nearly hit her. "This isn't right. We need to go." But as she spoke, something else happened. One of the nearby gravestones began to crack, a deep, jagged fissure splitting the stone in half. Then another. And another. All around them, the cemetery came alive with the sound of cracking stone and shifting dirt. "What's happening?" Chloe gasped, backing away from the graves, her face pale in the dim light. Ethan pulled out his phone, trying to find the signal. "We're trapped. There's no service." Jake, still trying to maintain some semblance of control, shook his head. "It's just old stone, it's falling apart. Let's just get out of here." But as they turned to leave, the gate they had come through slammed shut with a force that sent a reverberating clang through the cemetery. The sound echoed off the trees, bouncing around them like the toll of a bell. Jake ran to the gate, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how much he pushed or pulled, it was as if the cemetery itself had decided to lock them in. "Oh my God, we're trapped!" Chloe cried, her voice rising in panic. Ethan ran to help Jake, both of them pulling with all their strength. But the rusted gate remained unmoved. It was as if something far stronger than rust had locked it into place. Then came the voices. At first, it was a low murmur, barely audible over the sound of the wind and their own panicked breathing. But it grew louder, more distinct. Multiple voices, whispering, pleading, cursing. Words that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You disturbed our rest. Justice, vengeance. You will pay for their sins." Jake's face turned pale. "What the hell are they saying?" Lauren backed up, her flashlight shaking in her hands as she swung it around wildly, trying to find the source of the voices. Where are they coming from? But there was no source. The voices seemed to rise from the very ground beneath them, from the graves themselves. And then, with a sickening groan, the earth around the disturbed coffin split open, revealing something that made their blood run cold. A hand. Decayed and skeletal, it clawed its way out of the ground, its bony fingers grasping at the dirt as if pulling itself free. Jake stumbled backward, his bravado completely shattered as more skeletal hands began to emerge from the surrounding graves. "Run!" Ethan yelled, grabbing Chloe's arm and pulling her away from the rising dead. But there was nowhere to run. Everywhere they turned, more graves cracked open, more skeletal figures clawed their way out, their hollow eye sockets glowing with an unnatural light. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the voices grew louder, angrier. You disturbed our peace. You will pay the price." Jake, frozen with terror, stood paralyzed as one of the figures rose fully from the ground, its hollow skull turning towards him. Its jaw opened wide, and from its mouth came a voice far more powerful and ancient than the others. "Your blood will be our sacrifice." Chloe screamed, pulling free from Ethan's grip as the skeletal figures closed in, their bony hands reaching for them, their movements slow but unrelenting. Ethan, Lauren, and Jake ran towards the far side of the cemetery, dodging gravestones and tree roots, but no matter how far they ran, the figures followed, their glowing eyes never leaving their prey. "Over there!" Ethan shouted, pointing towards a small crypt at the edge of the cemetery. "We can hide." The four of them sprinted towards the crypt, the skeletal figures closing in behind them. Ethan yanked the iron door open, and they rushed inside, slamming it shut just as the first of the figures reached them. They could hear the scraping of bones against the metal door, the voices seeping through the cracks. "You cannot escape. You will pay." Inside the crypt, they huddled together, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The sound of their heartbeats pounded in their ears as they tried to calm down. But even as they caught their breath, the cold returned, creeping into the crypt like a silent predator. Lauren's voice trembled. "We're not safe, are we?" Jake didn't answer. He was staring at something on the wall of the crypt. Words scratched into the stone, barely visible in the dim light of their phones. Words that chilled them to the bone. "We disturbed their rest. Now they come for ours." The crypt's air was damp and suffocating, filled with the stench of rotting stone and something older, something that carried the weight of death. The four of them huddled near the door, their backs pressed against the cold wall. The voices outside had softened to a chilling murmur, but they hadn't disappeared. They could still hear the scratching of bones against the metal door, the occasional moan of something that had no business walking the earth. Jake was the first to break the silence. "This is insane," he muttered, his voice trembling. "We're not staying in here. We've got to get out." Chloe, her hands shaking, shot him a desperate look. "And go where, Jake?" "We're surrounded. Those things, they won't stop until they get us." Ethan paced back and forth in the cramped space, his phone's light flickering as he desperately searched for another way out. There has to be something. A back door, a tunnel. These old crypts sometimes have escape routes, right? Lauren didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the words scratched into the wall. "We disturbed their rest. Now they come for ours." It echoed in her mind like a death sentence. "This isn't just about us messing with the graves," she whispered. "Something was keeping them trapped, and we let them out." Ethan's light swept across the far wall of the crypt, revealing something that sent a shiver down his spine. At the base of the crypt, barely noticeable in the darkness, was a small door. A trapdoor. "Guys, over here," Ethan said, rushing to it. Jake was there in an instant, his hands frantically pulling at the old iron ring on the trapdoor. "Help me with this." Together, the four of them pulled, grunting with effort as the rusted hinges protested. With a loud groan, the door finally gave way, revealing a set of stone stairs that descended into a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light from their phones. "No way," Chloe whispered, staring down into the blackness. "We don't know where that leads." Jake shot her a look, his fear manifesting as anger. "You want to stay here and wait for them to break in? We don't have a choice." The sounds outside the crypt grew louder, more frantic, as if the skeletal figures knew their prey was slipping away. Chloe's breath quickened, but she nodded, stepping back as Jake and Ethan began descending the steps. The staircase was narrow and damp, the stone slick beneath their feet. The deeper they went, the colder it became, as though they were walking into the very heart of the cemetery's darkness. Their phones cast long shadows on the stone walls, illuminating the grime and decay that had built up over centuries. "Where does this even lead?" Lauren asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No idea," Ethan replied, his voice tight with fear. "But anywhere is better than up there." As they descended, the walls seemed to close in, the air growing thinner, colder. It wasn't just physical cold, it was something worse, something that chilled the soul. A weight pressed down on them, heavier with each step, as though the very air around them was filled with malevolent energy. Suddenly, Chloe let out a sharp gasp, stopping in her tracks. "Did you hear that?" They all froze, the silence pressing in around them like a vice. At first, there was nothing but the sound of their own breathing, but then it came, a faint whisper, so low it barely registered. It echoed through the stone, slithering through the darkness like a serpent. "Help us, free us." Jake swallowed hard. What the hell is that?" They looked at each other, fear stark in their eyes. The voices weren't behind them anymore. They were coming from below. Before anyone could react, the floor beneath Jake gave way with a deafening crack, sending him plunging into the darkness. "Jake!" Chloe screamed, reaching out for him, but it was too late. His flashlight tumbled down, the beam vanishing into the black void below. They rushed to the edge of the collapsed stone, hearts racing. "Jake! Jake, are you okay?" Ethan shouted, his voice trembling. A faint groan echoed from the darkness. I'm okay," came Jake's strained voice. "I think I hit my leg. It hurts, but I'm all right." "Stay there, we're coming down," Ethan called, his voice filled with tension. "Just hold on." Ethan, Chloe, and Lauren carefully climbed down into the dark pit, their flashlights illuminating the jagged stones that had crumbled away beneath Jake's fall. He sat against the wall, wincing in pain, clutching his leg. "We need to get out of here," Lauren whispered, panic creeping into her voice. "This place isn't safe." Chloe nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Jake, can you walk?" Jake gritted his teeth, standing slowly. "Yeah, I'll manage." They continued deeper into the underground passage, but the whispers followed them, growing louder with each step. The walls seemed to pulse with dark energy, and the cold gnawed at their bones. Ethan's light flickered again, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something moving in the shadows ahead. A figure, no, multiple figures, just out of reach of the light. "We're not alone down here," he muttered, his heart hammering in his chest. Suddenly, a bone-chilling scream erupted from behind them. Chloe turned just in time to see a skeletal hand reach up from the pit they had just crossed. The skeletal figures were following them, clawing their way through the earth, their hollow eyes locked onto the fleeing group. "Run!" Ethan shouted, pushing Jake forward as the ground beneath them began to tremble once more. The corridor ahead was narrow and winding, the walls closing in as the screams of the dead echoed in their ears. The passage seemed endless, a twisted maze that led deeper into the bowels of the earth. Panic surged through them as they ran, their breaths coming in sharp gasps. Lauren stumbled, nearly falling as her flashlight flickered. She caught herself just in time, her hand brushing against the wall, and that's when she saw it. Carved into the stone were more words, ancient and worn, but unmistakable. They were never meant to be freed. "We have to keep going," Chloe cried, grabbing Lauren's arm and pulling her forward. But even as they ran, the whispers grew louder, the shadows deeper, until they could no longer tell where the voices ended and the darkness began. The corridor twisted and turned in impossible ways, the stone beneath their feet slick and uneven. As they stumbled through the darkness, the whispers followed, growing louder with each passing second. They weren't just being chased, they were being herded, driven deeper into the ancient labyrinth beneath the cemetery. Chloe's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. We need to find a way out," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the echoes of their footsteps. "There has to be an end to this tunnel," Ethan said, his voice filled with a false confidence that was beginning to crack under the weight of terror. "Just keep moving." The light from their phones flickered intermittently, the batteries slowly draining, the darkness pressing in around them. Ethan's flashlight cast strange, distorted shadows on the walls, shapes that twisted and writhed as if the stone itself was alive, breathing with the cursed souls buried beneath it. Jake, limping behind the others, winced with every step. The pain in his leg was worsening, but he bit down on the agony, refusing to be left behind. "What if there's no way out?" he muttered, his voice tinged with despair. Lauren shot him a look, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't say that. There's always a way out." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure if she believed it. The air felt heavier down here, like something ancient was closing in around them, wrapping its cold fingers around their necks. Suddenly, the passageway ahead widened into a larger chamber. The air inside was thick with a musty smell, and the ground was covered in dirt and bones. Ancient tombs lined the walls, their stone lids cracked and weathered, as though they had been disturbed long ago. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, draped in the remnants of a decayed cloth. Symbols, dark and twisted, were carved into the stone. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. "What the hell is this place?" Lauren's eyes were drawn to the altar, her blood running cold. This isn't just a crypt. It's a shrine." "A shrine to what?" Chloe whispered, inching closer to the group, her eyes darting around the room. Jake, breathing heavily, leaned against the wall for support, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "We shouldn't be here. We need to leave." But before anyone could respond, the whispers that had been following them erupted into a chorus of guttural, enraged voices, echoing off the walls of the chamber. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble violently, and from the shadows, shapes started to materialize, faint at first, but growing more solid with each passing second. The dead were coming. "Move! Now!" Ethan shouted, grabbing Chloe's hand and pulling her toward the opposite end of the room, where another passageway loomed. They sprinted across the chamber, dodging the skeletal hands that began to reach out from the earth. The spirits of the condemned, their faces twisted with anger and pain, rose from the ground, their hollow eyes fixated on the living intruders who had dared to awaken them. Lauren screamed as one of the figures lunged at her, its bony fingers grazing her arm. She stumbled, nearly falling, but Ethan grabbed her just in time, dragging her toward the passageway. Behind them, Jake limped as fast as he could, the pain in his leg unbearable. He glanced back, his heart stopping as one of the spirits reached out for him. Its eyes were nothing but empty sockets, but its mouth twisted into a hideous grin as it clawed at the air, inches from Jake's throat. "No!" Jake screamed, his voice echoing in the chamber as he tried to hobble faster. The spirit's hand latched onto his ankle, pulling him down with a force that made the bones in his leg crack. Jake cried out in agony, clawing at the ground as he tried to pull himself free. "Jake!" Chloe screamed, her voice breaking with panic. But Ethan, gripping her arm, didn't stop running. "We can't help him. We need to go." Chloe struggled against him, tears streaming down her face as she watched Jake's body being dragged back into the shadows, his screams echoing through the chamber before being swallowed by the darkness. The three of them plunged into the passageway, running faster than they thought possible, driven by pure terror. The walls closed in around them, the air thick with dust and decay. Behind them, the spirits gave chase, their guttural moans growing louder, more furious. This tunnel has to lead somewhere. Ethan shouted between gasps, his heart hammering in his chest. It has to. Lauren didn't respond, her mind consumed by the image of Jake being dragged away. She could still hear his screams in her head, the sound of his bones breaking as the spirits took him. The tunnel twisted sharply, and suddenly, they burst into another chamber, this one smaller, darker, the walls lined with ancient skulls and bones. The air here was suffocating, filled with a thick, choking fog. "We're trapped," Chloe whimpered, her voice barely audible as she backed away from the entrance, her eyes wild with terror. "There's no way out." Ethan's flashlight flickered again, then died completely, plunging them into darkness. "Ethan, no!" Lauren's voice was trembling, panic surging through her as she fumbled with her own phone. The light blinked on, but the beam was weak, barely illuminating the walls around them. The spirits were close now. They could feel it, an icy presence that sent shivers down their spines, a darkness that seemed to press in on all sides. The air was thick with the sound of whispering voices, growing louder and louder until it became a deafening roar. "Ethan," Chloe's voice was a barely audible whimper now. "They're here." The room seemed to pulse with energy, a malevolent force pressing in on them, suffocating them. Ethan raised his phone, the weak beam of light illuminating the far wall. There, carved into the stone, were more symbols, twisted and ancient, pulsing with dark energy. Lauren's breath caught in her throat. "What is that?" Ethan didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the symbols, his mind racing. This wasn't just a crypt. This was a place of power, a place where the dead had been imprisoned for centuries. But now, the seals had been broken. The ground beneath them trembled once more, and from the shadows, the dead emerged, twisted, broken figures, their eyes filled with hatred, their skeletal hands reaching for the living. There was nowhere left to run. The air in the crypt felt like it was thickening with each passing second, pressing against their skin, making every breath harder to take. The dead had risen, no longer bound to the graves that had held them for centuries. Now, they moved with purpose, their hollow eyes focused on the living intruders who had violated their eternal slumber. Ethan's mind raced, desperately trying to formulate a plan. There was no going back. The tunnel behind them had collapsed under the weight of the spirit's fury. The only way was forward, but forward meant facing the full wrath of the condemned. "We need to move, now!" Ethan hissed through gritted teeth, his body shaking from adrenaline. He grabbed Chloe by the arm and pulled her toward the back of the crypt, where the stone symbols glowed faintly against the ancient wall. But before they could move far, a deafening crash echoed through the chamber. From the ground, the skeletal remains of long-dead criminals emerged, their fingers clawing through the dirt. Their hollow eyes burned with rage, their mouths twisted into grotesque sneers as they crawled toward the group with horrifying speed. Lauren gasped, stumbling back as one of the creatures lunged at her, its bony hands inches from her leg. She barely managed to jump out of the way, but Chloe wasn't so lucky. A cold, skeletal hand wrapped around her ankle, pulling her violently to the ground. "Chloe!" Ethan screamed, diving toward her, his hands grasping her wrist. He pulled with all his might, but the dead were stronger. Chloe's eyes widened in terror as she felt herself being dragged into the abyss, the cold touch of the undead sending icy shivers through her entire body. "Don't let go," she cried, her voice breaking with fear. Ethan held on for dear life, his muscles burning as he tried to free her. "I won't," he shouted, his voice raw from panic. But as the dead swarmed closer, their numbers overwhelming, it became clear that they would not leave without taking someone with them. "Ethan! We can't fight them all!" Lauren screamed, her eyes darting around the room for any possible escape. But there was none. The spirits were closing in, their twisted faces mere feet away. With one final pull, Ethan yanked Chloe free from the skeletal grip. She fell into his arms, gasping for breath, her body trembling uncontrollably. But there was no time to rest. The spirits were relentless, and the room had become a sea of death, the ground shifting under their feet as the dead rose. "We have to get to the altar," Lauren said, her voice hoarse with desperation. "There's something about those symbols. They're different from the others." Ethan didn't hesitate. With Chloe in tow, he bolted toward the altar, his heart pounding so loudly in his ears that he could barely hear the cacophony of voices surrounding them. The dead seemed to sense their intention, their movements growing faster, more aggressive as they tried to block the trio from reaching the shrine. "Faster," Ethan urged, pushing Chloe forward as they scrambled over bones and broken stone. Lauren was close behind, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Just as they reached the altar, a massive spirit, larger and more grotesque than the others, emerged from the shadows. Its body was a twisted mass of rotting flesh and bone, its eyes burning with hatred. It let out an unearthly wail that shook the entire crypt, sending dust and debris falling from the ceiling. "Get behind me!" Ethan shouted, his voice filled with determination. He grabbed a rusted piece of metal from the ground, a broken piece of one of the ancient tombs, and held it in front of him, as if it could somehow protect them from the abomination before them. The creature lunged, its claws outstretched, but just as it was about to reach them, a sudden light erupted from the altar. The symbols carved into the stone began to glow, brighter and brighter, until the entire room was bathed in an eerie, pulsating light. The spirits recoiled, their movements slowed as if they were being repelled by an invisible force. "What's happening?" Chloe gasped, shielding her eyes from the blinding light. Lauren's eyes widened as she studied the symbols. "This altar, it's a seal. It's been holding them here. But now it's breaking." Ethan's mind whirled as he tried to comprehend the situation. The altar had been the source of the spirits' imprisonment, but now that they had disturbed it, the very force that kept the dead at bay was failing. If they didn't act quickly, the condemned souls would be free to roam the world above, wreaking havoc on anyone they encountered. "We need to restore the seal," Ethan shouted over the growing cacophony of voices. "But how?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling. Lauren stepped forward, her hands shaking as she traced the symbols with her fingers. "These markings, they're not just decoration. They're part of a ritual. If we can figure out how to activate them, we might be able to trap the spirits again." Ethan's mind raced as he glanced around the room, searching for any clue that might help them. His eyes fell on the bones scattered around the altar, remains of the very criminals who had been condemned to this fate. "We need something from the dead," he muttered, piecing the puzzle together. "Their bones, they were part of the seal." Chloe's face paled. "You mean, we have to put them back?" "It's the only way," Ethan said, his voice grim. "If we don't, the dead will be free to take their revenge." Without another word, the three of them set to work, scrambling to gather the bones that littered the floor. The spirits, though slowed by the light, still moved toward them with unrelenting fury, their hollow eyes locked onto the living. Ethan threw bones onto the altar, matching them with the symbols etched into the stone. The light from the altar grew brighter with each bone placed, the air around them buzzing with energy. But the dead were closing in fast, their twisted hands reaching for the group. "Faster!" Lauren screamed, her hands trembling as she placed the final piece onto the altar. With a deafening roar, the altar erupted in a blinding flash of light. The spirits let out anguished screams as they were pulled back toward the earth, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. The ground shook violently as the crypt began to collapse around them. "We need to get out of here," Ethan shouted, grabbing Chloe and Lauren by the arms as the ceiling crumbled above them. They sprinted toward the exit, dodging falling debris and crumbling stone. Behind them, the crypt continued to implode, the walls cracking as the spirits were forced back into their graves. The light from the altar flickered one last time before dying out completely, leaving the chamber in complete darkness. They burst through the entrance of the crypt and into the night air, gasping for breath as they collapsed onto the ground. The cemetery was eerily quiet now, the spirits of the condemned silenced once more. For a moment, they lay there in stunned silence, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. The nightmare was over, but the memories of what they had witnessed would haunt them forever. Ethan was alone. The silence around him was more suffocating than the screams of Chloe and Lauren. Each of them had been taken in different ways, swallowed by the wrath of the condemned. He could still hear the distant echoes of Lauren's cries, mingled with cruel laughter that came from all directions. The smell of damp earth and decay filled the air as the cold wind blew, cutting his skin like tiny blades of ice. He knew there was nowhere left to run, no way out. But now, there was something else. In the depths of the darkness surrounding the cemetery, Ethan felt a presence watching him. Not the furious spirits, not the shadows of the trees, but something bigger. Something ancient. The legends Lauren had mentioned earlier began to intertwine in his mind. The condemned weren't just trapped in the earth. They were guardians of something deeper. Something that should never have been awakened. Ethan felt a growing pressure in his head, as if he were being pulled into a memory that wasn't his own. Suddenly, he saw flashes of images, men being led to the gallows, their faces twisted with fear and hatred. A woman, accused of witchcraft, with tears of rage as her skin burned in the flames. A boy, buried alive after being wrongfully convicted of theft. These souls had suffered unimaginable tortures, and the cemetery wasn't just a resting place, it was a prison for their eternal fury. He fell to his knees before an open grave, feeling the weight of the injustice that the condemned carried. These spirits weren't just seeking revenge, they demanded that someone pay for the sins of others. And Ethan, by being there, by disturbing what should never have been touched, was now at the center of that reckoning. But something caught his eye, a tombstone that looked older than all the others, hidden in the shadows. The names carved were almost unreadable, but one word stood out: Liberator. The figure Ethan had seen in his visions wasn't just an ordinary spirit. It was the key to what kept all the other condemned souls trapped there. Freeing that soul would mean unleashing the wrath of all the others. He stumbled toward the gravestone, his trembling hands clearing the dirt that covered the face carved into the stone. The spirit of the Liberator materialized before him, more terrifying than anything he could have imagined. The hollow eyes of the figure locked onto Ethan's, and a voice echoed in his mind, "You must take their place. Only then can they rest." Ethan felt the weight of the offer. He could end it all right there. The spirits of the condemned could finally rest, and his friends would not have died in vain. But he would have to pay the ultimate price. He would be condemned to wander that cemetery without rest for all eternity. He hesitated, his mind spinning with the terror of an impossible choice. But the voices of the spirits were now louder. Someone must pay. Someone must pay. The ground beneath Ethan began to give way, as if the hands of the condemned were trying to pull him into the earth. And then he understood. The suffering he had witnessed, the tormented souls that had hunted him, it was all part of a macabre cycle that would never end. If he didn't make a choice, he, Lauren, Chloe, all of them would be condemned to wander the ruins of that cemetery forever. Someone had to break the cycle. In a final act of courage, or perhaps desperation, Ethan threw himself into the open grave, shouting the name of the Liberator. He felt the cold hands of the spirits tightening against his skin, dragging him into the void. Silence fell over the cemetery. For a moment, it seemed like everything was finally over. The wind stopped blowing, and the dense, oppressive air gave way to a strange calm. The spirits were free. Chloe and Lauren, the only survivors, awoke at dawn, their memories blurred by the horrors they had witnessed. They never found Ethan's body. To them, he became a legend, a distorted memory of that night's nightmare. But as they left the cemetery, the mist began to rise again. The graves, which had seemed calmed, started to stir slightly, as if something, or someone, was awakening again. And so, the cycle would begin anew. The cemetery of the condemned would never truly rest. The spirits may have been appeased for a time, but the cycle of vengeance and punishment would return, like a curse that could never be broken. Deep among the twisted gravestones, the wind carried a final phrase, a whisper filled with hatred and pain: "You are never truly free."